Frederick Benteen spent the better part of his military career watching a man he despised get celebrated for things that, in Benteen's estimation, would eventually get soldiers killed. He wasn't quiet about it. He wasn't the kind of man who kept his mouth shut when he believed something was fundamentally wrong. And in the United States Army of the 1870s, that kind of raw honesty had a way of making enemies faster than it made allies. But before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel to support our community. The hatred between Benteen and George Armstrong Custer didn't begin at the Little Bighorn. It began 8 years earlier in the snow-covered lowlands of the Washita River in Indian Territory on a cold November morning in 1868 when Custer led the 7th Cavalry in a dawn assault on a Cheyenne village. The raid was considered a tactical success by the Army brass. Custer made sure of that. He sent dispatches ahead of himself, controlled the narrative with practiced precision, and rode into Fort Dodge with a string of captured horses and a headline already written in his head. What the dispatches omitted was Major Joel Elliott. Elliott had led a detachment of roughly 17 men downstream in pursuit of fleeing warriors and never returned. Custer didn't wait. He didn't organize a search, didn't send riders to locate the missing detachment, didn't do the thing that every standard of military command demanded he do. Instead, he gathered his dead, burned the village, slaughtered the pony herd, and marched his regiment out of the valley with the regimental band playing "Ain't I Glad to Get Out of the Wilderness." Elliott and his men were found weeks later, their bodies mutilated in the frozen earth less than 2 miles from where the regiment had stood. Benteen was present for all of it. He watched it happen, and he never forgave it. He wrote an anonymous letter to a Missouri newspaper laying out exactly what had occurred, identifying Custer without using his name, describing Elliott's abandonment in language that stripped away the heroic veneer one careful sentence at a time. The letter circulated through military communities. Officers read it aloud at mess tables. Custer eventually traced it back to Benteen. He confronted him in front of the assembled regiment, a horsewhip in his hand, and Benteen reportedly told him plainly to go ahead and use it, that if he did, Benteen would kill him where he stood. Custer never brought the whip down. He never addressed the letter publicly again, and neither did Benteen. But the damage between them had calcified into something permanent. What Benteen understood about Custer, and what he spent years trying, in his blunt and frequently insubordinate way, to force others to reckon with, was that Custer operated according to a logic that bore no relationship to the welfare of the men beneath him. His calculus was personal fame, press coverage, and the next promotion. He took risks that more measured commanders wouldn't take, not out of battlefield courage, but out of ambition. And he had learned early that the Army tended to reward the officer who brought back the biggest headline, rather than the one who brought back the most soldiers alive. The institution fed his worst instincts at every turn. Benteen watched this pattern play out across nearly a decade of frontier campaigning. He watched Custer push columns harder than terrain, or horses could sustain. He watched him make unilateral decisions that bypassed both protocol and intelligence. He watched him perform for newspaper correspondents camped alongside the regiment, while enlisted men went without adequate food and equipment. And Benteen said so, not always through proper channels, not always with the diplomatic restraint that the Army preferred. But he said so, and there is a long paper trail to prove it. By the time the 7th Cavalry rode out of Fort Abraham Lincoln in May of 1876, Benteen carried no illusions about what Custer was or what he was capable of. The expedition moving against a coalition of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho fighters had been estimated by scouts at several thousand warriors strong, a force significantly larger than anything the regiment had previously engaged in the field. General Alfred Terry's operational plan was a coordinated convergence, multiple columns closing simultaneously on the encampment to prevent the village from scattering before contact. The strategy demanded patience and communication. It demanded that individual unit commanders subordinate personal initiative to collective timing. These were qualities that Custer's entire career had demonstrated he did not possess. On the morning of June 25, 1876, Custer had the village at the Little Bighorn under surveillance from the Wolf Mountains. He knew the encampment was large. His own Crow and Arikara scouts told him repeatedly it was unlike anything they had seen. He also knew his regiment had been spotted, and that the element of surprise he had been counting on was already compromised. Terry and Gibbon were a day's march away. The coordinated plan was viable if Custer simply held his position for 24 hours. He divided his regiment into 3 battalions instead. One went to Major Marcus Reno, one to Benteen, and the 3rd Custer kept for himself. Benteen was dispatched on a scouting sweep to the south and west, a direction for which there was no intelligence suggesting a threat, no tactical objective that any of the surviving officers could later articulate with clarity. Historians have spent generations debating the order's purpose. The most pointed reading is simply that Custer sent his most dangerous internal critic on a purposeless errand, while he rode toward what he expected to be the defining moment of his public life. Reno struck the southern end of the village first and was overwhelmed almost immediately. Warriors flooded out of the camp in numbers that swallowed his attack before it could develop momentum. Reno retreated to the bluffs above the river in a disorganized withdrawal that cost him nearly a third of his command. When Benteen arrived back from the south, he found Reno's survivors on the high ground, shattered and taking fire from multiple directions. He made the decision to consolidate the position rather than push forward blind into terrain he hadn't seen, and toward a command he had no reliable information about. Then the note arrived, carried by trumpeter John Martin, scrawled in the hand of Adjutant William Cook. Benteen. Come on. Big village. Be quick. Bring packs. Benteen didn't come on fast enough, according to the critics who spent the following decades building a case against him. What he came onto was a defensive position with a demoralized, partially broken force, no knowledge of Custer's location, no reliable picture of the terrain ahead, and a village of warriors that had just destroyed one of the regiment's 3 battalions in under an hour. He made a judgment call that he defended with unflinching specificity for the rest of his life, that riding forward with what remained would not have saved Custer. It would have added his men's bodies to the ridge. By the time Benteen and Reno's combined survivors attempted to push north toward Custer's last known position, the battle there had been over for some time. Every man in Custer's battalion was dead. The congressional hearings and court-martial proceedings that followed in subsequent years dragged the battle repeatedly back into public examination. Benteen testified at the Reno Court of Inquiry in 1879 with the calm precision of a man who had been thinking about these events for 3 years and had no interest in softening anything. He described Custer's decision to divide the regiment as tactically indefensible given the intelligence available. He described the scouting order to the south as tactically purposeless. He described a command culture within the 7th Cavalry in which Custer's personal ambition had functionally replaced institutional doctrine, and in which officers who raised objections found their careers managed accordingly. The professional historical consensus that has solidified over the past 50 years has largely confirmed the substance of what Benteen argued in that courtroom. Custer made cascading errors on June 25th, attacking without adequate reconnaissance, dividing his force against a numerically superior enemy he had been repeatedly warned not to underestimate, discarding the coordinated operational plan that gave the campaign its best chance of success, and launching his assault before the other columns could position themselves. These are not contested points in serious scholarship. They are the working conclusions of military historians who have spent careers reconstructing the battle from every available source. But in 1876 and for decades afterward, none of that analysis had any purchase on the public narrative. That narrative belonged to Libby Custer, Elizabeth Bacon Custer, who outlived her husband by 57 years and spent the bulk of that time constructing a monument to his memory that was genuinely difficult to argue against in polite company. She wrote books, she gave lectures, she cultivated relationships with veterans, journalists, and politicians who could sustain the image she was building. She worked with relentless discipline, and she was effective in ways that a woman in her era rarely got credit for. In the story Libby and her allies maintained, Benteen was the failure, the man who moved too slowly, whose personal animosity toward Custer had compromised his judgment at the critical moment, whose bitterness made him an unreliable narrator of everything that followed. It was a coherent story. It also happened to be, in its essential architecture, wrong. What the actual record shows is a man who had been correct about Custer for the better part of 8 years before anyone was positioned or willing to hear it, who watched those warnings validated on the worst afternoon in the regiment's history, and who then spent the remainder of his military career being held responsible for a catastrophe that the commanding officer's own decisions had made inevitable. Benteen never made general. He ended his active service under a court-martial in 1887, a separate incident involving alcohol, which provided a convenient final note for people who had always preferred to read him as the villain of the piece. He died in Atlanta in 1898, largely forgotten outside of a small community of veterans and historians. The letters he left behind number in the hundreds, written with the directness of a man who had stopped managing his reputation sometime around 1868 and never started again. Historians who have worked through that correspondence at length tend to come away with a complicated admiration for him. Not because he was uncomplicated, not because he was always right, and certainly not because he was easy, but because he said true things in a professional culture that punished honesty, and because the core of what he argued held up. The soldiers who rode north with Custer on that last June afternoon didn't get the monuments quickly. They got a mass grave on a hillside in Montana, marked by simple white stones that stretch across the ridge in rows that still stop visitors cold when they see them for the first time. Benteen had their names right. He had what happened to them right. He had why it happened right. That it took the better part of a century for the historical record to fully catch up with what one ornery, insubordinate, largely despised cavalry officer had been saying all along is not a footnote to the story of the Little Bighorn. It is, in many ways, the story.